Hello everyone, welcome to another best practice video. I'm really pleased to be joined by Steve Winoker, who is the Vice President of Investor Communications at General Electric. Steve, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be here.
Excellent. So Steve, I wanted to bring you in and have a chat because obviously 2020 and all of the events have been a challenge for everyone, but it's particularly pertinent for General Electric with regards to the sort of sectors that you're in. As an IR team, how have you navigated GE's investors through these kind of troubling times?
Right. Well, you're exactly right. To say that 2020 was a challenge is an understatement, and it is a challenge, and we are working through that. IR, I think, played an important role in general before the pandemic, obviously through the pandemic, and hopefully afterwards. Within GE, which is already going through a major transformation, to layer this on top of that transformation, we have a new CEO that came in October of 2018, Larry Culp, and that really set the stage for what was going to be a multi-year transformation. That's still true, but you're just layering on top of that huge pressure from our aviation business, which is the core of our cash flow globally. Healthcare, a lot of elective procedures that have been pushed out. That's also a big part of our cash flow generation. And then we have a lot of turnaround businesses internally, which are still turning around, but obviously with more difficulty due to reduced mobility and all of those things. So IR already was about maintaining a two-way relationship with our investors. We are about as much listening as communicating. And that's really critical because we're the bridge. We really serve as a bridge internally and externally with investors in the markets. What we're really trying to do, and I think, for better or worse, I came out of the sell side as an investor or with investors and into GE. And as Larry knew, my view was you've got to speak truth to power. You've got to bring the reality of the day and recognize that before you can, know what the right thing is to do. And so we really think it's important for our whole group to just make sure we understand what the market is saying, broadly speaking. And I know there are a lot of segments in the market, but understand what those things are. Bring that truth, that reality internally, and calibrate it and balance it against all the factors and the internal information that we have that the market doesn't have, as well as we think about what are the right things to do and how do we communicate those. So that's important. The second part I'd say is transparency. Really focusing on transparency, helping investors understand what we're seeing and what we're doing in the current environment without getting ahead of our skis, with conjecture about how COVID-19 will exactly play out. We talk through what we know, we talk through what we can control, and not just end up in a cacophony of part of the cacophony of guessing games that can be out there. I mean, obviously everyone can run lots and lots of scenarios all the time, really trying to focus on, look, here's what we know, here's what we think, here's some scenarios that might play out. But we want to give you visibility in you as an investor in your investment process to help that, right? That's where we're headed. We're not trying to sell anything, just trying to say, look, here's an understanding of our business. Here are the things that are impacting us. Here's what we're experiencing. You take that into your investment considerations. This effectively helps investors understand, I think, the earnings and cash flow potential for the company longer term. That's a result of our markets, our customers, the technology we have, the operations we're running, the teams, and the quality of those teams that are tasked with delivering those results, all attempting to make something that is very complex across our businesses, our markets, all the things involved with GE, to try to make those as simple as possible. And this is a continuing path. It's going to take a long time for us to keep making this complex entity and a complex world more and more simple for investors. But when you think about investors who are dealing with sometimes hundreds of stocks, let alone, and certainly dozens, right, at any one time, how do you make it simple for them, starting from a complex place, right? Also making ourselves accessible. I think that's been important and is important through this whole process. Accessible through multiple channels with the company. So helping people understand what we're reporting, a sense for what senior management and the board are focused with priorities business by business. So for example, some of the things we did with channels, and this won't be new to many of my colleagues across the investment world, introducing our new CFO, Carolina Dybeck-Hapa, to the investment community virtually. So for the sell side, for the buy side, equity, fixed income, just trying to make her available the same way you and I are talking right now. So that has been important. And then helping investors see all along the way what progress we're making with regard to our priorities. So on a multi-year transformation that we're on, building momentum toward a stronger company, a stronger GE, so that especially on the other side of COVID-19, they can see we are de-risking our balance sheet in our case, we're driving efforts to go lean and drive lean deeper into our businesses, making sure that our businesses are taking our efforts and mitigating and offsetting these enormous COVID-19 headwinds that we face in the near term and medium term without sacrificing the long term. So we have plenty of opportunity to improve. We have upside across the portfolio that goes for investor relations as much as everybody else within the company. But all of this is underpinned by, I think, important cultural changes and operational improvements that we're driving across the company. More transparency, more candor, more humility, more better focus, better prioritization, all of these things.
Yeah, great points. And I think there's lots to pick out of that in terms of, listening, being transparent, being accessible, keeping the information concise. Sometimes there's that temptation to kind of get out there and give everyone everything. But understanding the workload of that your stakeholders and everyone that you speak
Exactly.
to, I think that's great. So just on, as you highlighted, the kind of headwinds and some of those big macroeconomic changes, have you noticed anything around things like ESG factors? Are you finding that investors are taking more of a hard line on some ESG factors?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things, both macro and ESG, I'd speak to on that front. On the ESG front, it is clearly becoming an increasing factor for investors. Not only ESG-focused funds, but even more broadly. Now, we sit squarely in the middle of this energy transition globally with, we've got a $15 billion renewable energy business, which is mostly equipment. We have an $18 billion power business that's more heavily services oriented. So we very much here in the middle of this transition and how that's going to happen. Similarly, both in terms of how we run our company from a governance perspective, all of the elements that are going on globally, I think investors are taking an interest in all of these things. I would say that COVID-19, it's not that it's slowed it down, it's just changed the prioritization of investors coming into us. So, the first part of the conversation is going to be about our aviation business or about our healthcare business, right? And the ESG factors are important. I would say they have just slowed down a little bit in terms of broad interest, given, I think, the pandemic. But there's no question, if I sort of track it over a longer period of time, it is increasing. It's increasing rapidly. And I think, both in terms of not only, dedicated funds out there, but just this is going to be a kind of, minimum key to doing business. You're going to have to address this, talk about these factors, and what your company is doing about them. And so I think that is one of our major initiatives internally. And so I think as you sort of look at us externally over the next few years, you'll see this becoming a bigger and bigger part of our own dialogue, actions and dialogue, I should say, internally and externally.
Yeah, no, definitely. And are there any other sort of extra elements that you've integrated into your IR program to help with those communications? Have things like online events become more important? And yeah, I guess what I'm really interested in is changes that you've made in the short term, and also the sort of more permanent changes that you're going to keep on. For example, are you going to travel as much as you were before, and those sort of aspects? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on short and long-term changes.
Sure. Well, it's interesting. I mean, some of the changes that we are experiencing right now are a result of the combination of technology capability increasing over time in terms of virtual meetings like you and I are having right now, along with, I think, a desire by people to do this more frequently and for people to accept it, both internally and externally. In our case, obviously, like every other company, we've had many buy-side Microsoft Teams and Zoom meetings. Okay, so those have absolutely since March replaced the face-to-face at that time period. We've also participated in sell-side virtual conferences, right? So there've been a number of conferences. They've tended to move virtually. I think for a first time, everybody's kind of getting used to it. What's the experience like? And I think you're just seeing that what I'm already seeing inside of, I guess, 6 months is the sophistication of how those things work logistically is getting better, right? And sort of the technology hiccups and things like that, everyone's working through. So people understand already, but I think there's a little more of that, which is helpful. We work with sell-siders sometimes to host focused virtual meetings on a specific conference topic. It might be with one of our businesses or a particular question in which investors have expressed an interest. And then we continue to work our communications channels in terms of our IR communications, newsletters, our reports, our enhancements to our own disclosures on the Qs and the K. And then I think greater media accessibility and social media as well. There's a little bit more on that front too. So all of those things are kind of coalescing. I think at the end of the day though, we are huge believers. I'm personally a big believer in the value of face-to-face interaction, contact, body language, all the things that you get from meeting folks. And I think certainly externally for investors and customers, and I often think of those in my world very similarly, that those are worth face-to-face. And I think we will travel more, not less, when this thing, when we get through to the other side of this, in terms of just catch up a little bit, right? In terms of the relationships that we've got out there and wanting to meet and talk to people. But then I think it'll settle down, and I think you'll see a higher number of these kinds of interactions on top of the conferences, on top of those, those other points. So I expect people to travel again. I expect my team to travel a lot again, and I think we'll be out there. It's going to be, I think, supplemented with these technology tools, right? So I think you're going to end up with more interaction and just split both ways.
Yeah, absolutely, which is fantastic. I mean, we've sort of woken up to the capabilities, and yeah, it can only mean
yes.
More communication, more dialogue, as you said before, can only be a good thing. Do you have any, I'm just curious if you've got any tips from virtual meetings, attending virtual investor conferences. If I was to come to you and have never done one of these before, what do you think is kind of fundamental advice?
It's a great question. I think just like a live conference, the question is, how do you create a Zoom or Teams environment which feels like a real fireside chat, or if you're hosting, or feels like a real small group meeting, right? So it's always tempting with Teams and Zoom, especially, to increase participation and attendance. So what's one more, square tile, right, on one of these things? There's no incremental cost, and yet you get more people. But I think it's really important to keep them a little more intimate, I think really reaching out to investors and trying to make it feel like an in-person, smaller group discussion, feel like one. I think that's important. I think being clear about how people speak up on the phone, it's easy when there's 2 or 3, but when you have 15 people, it's a little harder than when you're sitting around a table and get a sense, and sometimes people can talk over one another. So just kind of being clear about moderating some of that might be helpful if you do have a lot of folks on the phone. Those are kind of the bigger things. And again, finding kind of both forums to get diverse groups on, and to get those that might be all in one city or multiple cities, right? I think those are all kind of different ideas that in terms of how do you run a virtual roadshow, right? As another example, a non-disclosure roadshow, right? How do you do things that make people want to participate and truly get your point across. You can also do things in these meetings which you can't do as well in person, right? So, we haven't done very much of it, but whether it doesn't have to be slides per se, but you can show content, right, on this at the same time that you're talking to folks. You're like, well, that's a good point. Let me show you something that's interesting. Like, so creating a little more of that familiarity, I think, and using some of the tools that technology affords can potentially buffer your investment case, or allow you to buffer your investment case with investors.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. The final thing, and we're asking this to a lot of people that we're speaking to, slightly more philosophical, but what is great IR to you? What are the hallmarks of an investor relations program?
It's a great question. I mean, I think both on the standpoint that I have now, and having been on the other side of the table for something like 13 years, 12, 13 years beforehand, I think a lot of it does start with trust, candor, transparency, right? And feeling like, look, you're talking to a group that's the bridge with the company to help you understand the business, and vice versa, to help investors understand what's going on. And if you don't have that candor, if you don't have that transparency, I think it's really hard to really amplify your company's message, to really make it make investors want to take the time to invest in just investing the time and understanding the business. So that's one thought. Another one is like our job very much is not to sell, right? Strong IR helps investors with their investment processes, which I keep saying. It helps investors understand complex, multi-business, multinational organizations like ours, thinking about all these dimensions around earnings and cash flow potential over time, and making something complex as simple as possible. And admittedly, this is easier said than done, but it's a journey for us, and I'm sure a lot of other companies. Being accessible again to investors, reaching out proactively and not just reactively through multiple channels, I think is another hallmark of that. I'd say for us, if I sort of step back, and that's probably those are probably the most important items.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And the final thing, I know that you have regularly been commended by the investment community and by the peers for, General Electric's investor relations efforts. When you look back, let's say it's December the 31st, 11:59 p.m., what are you going to be most proud of in terms of you and your team's effort this year?
Well, I mean, thank you for those kind comments. I have worked alongside many of my peer companies for a lot of years, and I have extraordinary respect and admiration for so many of them and their IR efforts, right? So, a lot of what we have been attempting to do at GE builds on the learnings we have from other companies, right? And from our investors, from our customers, again, listening to them. I think at the end of, if you're just talking 2020, the end of the year, I think we will be most proud of the kind of resilience of the teams within GE, honestly, through an extraordinary set of challenges brought on by exogenous variables, right? By external elements, by COVID, and having sort of persevered through that internally to take the actions we need to set the company up as part of this multi-year transformation and make it stronger longer term. At the same time, I think helping investors through that period understand what literally we are facing and the reality of that, and that people say, you know what, you leveled with us about just how bad it was and how difficult it was. But then we also see the actions that you took to make this a stronger company longer term. And while that's been painful on the stock price this year, particularly, I think that sets up the company to be in a much stronger place culturally longer term internally, because people are sort of, even accelerating a lot of actions that were already under place, accelerating the cultural transformation, accelerating the things we're doing operationally, and then resulting in better financials, all of those things. And then I think just our relationship with investors who hopefully can feel like, look, at our very worst time in the trough, we were right out there as visible and as clear as we could be. I hope that we can say all those things at the end of the year.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you so much for joining us. There's some great pieces there around how you've built credibility through proactive communications, through listening, as well as some really nice tactical things around numbers that you should involve on video calls and that sort of thing. So really, really helpful. Thank you ever so much for your time, Steve. Really appreciate it. And look forward to speaking to you again.
Absolutely. Thank you, and stay safe, everybody.
You too, Steve. Thanks a lot.